Don't include that. Don't include that. I'm not. I don't want any trouble. Please don't include.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast. I am Devin Wiles, one of your co-hosts alongside Jake Grossman. We will be representing MSAP and MFans all year, two clubs based at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we'll be talking about baseball and football throughout our time here. We're really excited to get started with this. Our two clubs have been around for a little while now. MSAP was founded in 2016. It's the Michigan Society for American Baseball Research. It's really just a bunch of baseball nerds who get together and watch and talk about baseball and do all that fun stuff. And then we have MFans, which is the Michigan Football Analytics Society, which was established 2 years later by a few of the same students, along with some others. Really, we're just here to kind of grow the analytics space in a way, from like a college student perspective, which has been super fun to be involved with. And we do have some guests here who are our current co-presidents of MSAP and MFans. We have John Ilievsky and Jack Reinhardt, so welcome.
Hey, what's going on, Devin?
We appreciate you coming
Thank you for having us.
on our first episode.
So happy to have you guys on.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know. Y'all want to introduce yourselves at all? Give us a little rundown.
Sure. This is my first podcast appearance I've ever been on, so I'm very excited. But yeah, I guess my name's John. I'm a huge Mets fan. I've been going to Mets games since 2014 with my dad. At least 10 games a year. I remember in like 2012, for some reason I had a TV in my bedroom, and my dad and I was watching the Yankees, and so my dad, he comes into my room and he says, you know, the Mets, they're a lot closer to us. If you want to actually go to games, you should be a Mets fan. And from that point on, I became a Mets fan, and that was it.
Wait, so you were a Yankee fan, converted Met fan?
Yeah, I was a Yankee fan for a week. And then my dad came into my room, told me that. And ever since then, huge Mets fan.
All right, Jack?
Yeah, my name is Jack Reinhardt. And I've been a Lions, Tigers, Red Wings fan since they cut my umbilical cord. That's something that I've been, I was born into this. It's, since I've been able to actually remember my sports fandom, I really haven't seen a lot of success. People talk about the 2010 Red Wings Cup run, and that's, I don't remember that. And but my Tigers are cooking, my Lions are cooking, my Wings could be cooking, so it's great. But I'm a huge football guy. I love baseball and hockey as well, as I said, and I currently write for the Fantasy Footballers podcast. So that's the furthest extent to my sports profession.
Let's maybe take the opportunity to introduce ourselves, Devin. So yeah, I'm Jake Grossman, law student actually here at Michigan. Just got into sports analytics with respect to basketball. Actually, I've been working with a Puerto Rican basketball team called the Guaynabo Mets for the last I think it's 5 years now.
The Guaynabo Mets.
Yeah, we didn't it was an expansion team when I first got involved, but we didn't name it that just because of the New York ties of everyone involved. I think it was just actually the generational name of that basketball team because it's sort of in the metropolitan area. But Guaynabo Mets, that's been really fun. And then I've gotten really involved in football analytics research, football contract stuff. Got an opportunity to participate in the Tulane Pro Football Negotiation Competition. I've had the really cool opportunity to just interact with all the sports analytics folks on Twitter and other spaces and sort of just learn from everyone in the space and sort of pick up all that knowledge.
Yeah, and I am Devin Wiles. I'm a junior right now at Michigan. Been involved with MSAP since as soon as I saw it, a week into my tenure here at the University of Michigan. So it's been a lot of fun. Have been heading up our writing and everything on our website, msap.com. It's been, a lot of fun to kind of work on some projects in the analytics space and not even in the analytics space, just talking about baseball. Super enjoyable, especially because I'm a Tigers fan, grew up an hour away from the University of Michigan, and we're hot right now. I gotta say, this has been
so hot.
This has been a fun stretch for sure. But outside of that, though, I have for the last 2 summers I've worked for the United Shore Professional Baseball League based in Utica, Michigan. in the baseball operations department. This year, we had the opportunity to work with TrackMan data for the first time, and I kind of headed up the whole beginning of that TrackMan program.
I was
and
part of it this year.
John was
by the
part of it.
way.
John
Yeah.
did some great work for us. It was super fun, and we got to kind of do a lot of fun projects, and then also work in the analytics space and kind of draw our knowledge of that space of the game. And I think that kind of contributes to coming here and talking about stats a little bit. So, given the nature of our clubs, our podcast will kind of center around baseball and football primarily, but we'll definitely hit on some larger overarching topics in sports analytics. The uptick in the use of metrics at the highest levels of sports in recent years has been quite extraordinary. I think we've kind of all seen that rise occur, and kind of as the major sports leagues have honed in on that, and as teams have kind of honed in on that, it's become something that's more normal and something that we all kind of want to get into and want to be in that space and learn more. And I know as teams are learning, we're doing the same. So just kind of have those discussions from a perspective surrounding baseball, football, and sports as a whole. So our first segment is our stat of the week. To start off in the sports analytics space, we have to think about what is an all-encompassing statistic that we can kind of use to kind of just evaluate who's the best, like who are the best players on their teams in the league, and that is WAR. So you might think of WAR as traditionally something that is in baseball, wins above replacement, but
Or just wars in general. Like,
well, yeah, those two.
Yeah.
I feel like I associate wars more with football. Like, that's like the whole old George Carlin bit of like football is like war, while baseball is more of like a nice day in the park. Like, it's like, yeah.
That is certainly
George
one
Carlin made that
interpretation.
joke?
Yeah, I believe that's.
Oh.
I think that was his bit, the football versus baseball. Could I be wrong? You would
No.
know way better than me.
I trust you. I need to listen to some more George Carlin, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, John does comedy on the side.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
a-
Yeah, I do that. That was not part of my... I left a lot out in my intro. I think I even left out my last name, Ilievsky. That's how you pronounce it. John Ilievsky, for the record. My first podcast appearance. So if you're buying this podcast in the future for whatever reason, this is my first appearance. Should go for millions.
All right.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Just like Ohtani's baseball.
Just
Yeah.
like Ohtani's baseball.
And we're about to get into Ohtani in a minute, actually, which is going to be a pretty interesting discussion because he is kind of off the walls absurd when it comes to WAR and what he did in that game recently. But kind of digging into WAR a little bit from the baseball perspective, it was first kind of brought up in conversation by Bill James, who's like the changing of basically everything we're doing here, at least from the baseball side, and honestly, not just baseball, yeah, sports as a whole. He did so much to kind of start the rise of analytics, and he created something that is sabermetrics, and that's like what our podcast
Literally.
that's what our club,
Shout out
Yeah.
Bill
our
if
club
you're
is.
listening
Let's
right
go,
now.
Bill.
M Saber.
Thank you, Bill.
Sabermetrics.
Thank you, Mr. James.
So when we look at WAR from the baseball perspective, there's a few guys that really stick out that come to mind when we think about this statistic, and those are Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth is the all-time career leader in WAR. He also had the 3 highest individual WAR seasons of all time. And yes, people make the argument like he was pitching and hitting against plumbers. I guess was like the old saying, but I mean, in his time, in his game, he's in the era, he was the greatest who played, and I guess there's a GOAT conversation to be had there. But
Instead of plumbers, I would say World War I vets. But yeah, the point stands.
yeah,
That sounds a lot better. World War I vets.
For playing sports,
Well, and still, just like the magnitude of it. you know?
Battle hardened guys. You know?
Yeah.
that's a fair point. Some of the other top seasons that come to mind are that Carl Yastrzemski season. So before my guy Miguel Cabrera, the last time it occurred was 1967. That was Carl Yastrzemski, that Triple Crown season, and that's actually the 4th highest individual WAR season of all time. So absolute stud. And then like Bond's 73 home run 2001 also comes to mind.
Steroids.
And yeah, well, we can definitely have that conversation at some point. I think there's something to be said there. But-
Definitely a lot of things to be said there.
But yeah, I mean, any thoughts on John, from a baseball perspective, like what are your thoughts on WAR as a statistic and kind of some of the guys that come to mind for you?
Well, it's definitely flawed, I would say. Well, what comes to mind this year at least Francisco Lindor, he had the highest WAR in the National League until he got injured, and now Shohei has the highest WAR. Now he'll just win MVP for the next 10 years because he'll be able to pitch and bat, and it's not going to be fair for anyone. This was the 1 year that someone other than Ohtani could have won the MVP, but now this is it. And now Ohtani's just going to win forever. It's going to be boring. The MLB Instagram page is just going to be Ohtani, 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 and that's it. That's it. But getting back to your point about WAR, anyway. I guess, what do you ask? Lindor? Lindor comes to mind when I think of WAR. Lindor, that's the first guy, I would say. Batters, they do tend to have more WAR than pitchers. I think, I don't know. WAR, it's probably the best all-encompassing statistic, at least in baseball, that we have today to actually to just value a player and what they're contributing in general. But WAR is also a little flawed because it also depends on your situation. It depends on the guys you have around you. It depends on the park factors even as well. Like in the Oakland Coliseum, which no one's gonna play in anymore. It's very hard to hit home runs when you're playing there. A lot of home run hitters will hit, I guess, will not hit home runs that they usually would in other ballparks. And then they'll turn into fly ball outs, and that's no WAR right there.
Well, in the case of Aaron Judge, there's that great Twitter account that shows, how many ballparks a home run would be a home run in. And, Aaron Judge has had a great collection of single ballparks, being Yankee Stadium's short porch out in right field. So,
And that contributes positively to WAR when it wouldn't in any other ballpark, right?
Well, I thought it was my understanding that WAR uses ballpark factors, but
Do
maybe...
they?
Yes, it does.
Oh,
yeah, it includes
right.
park factors.
Cut that out. Cut everything I said out.
Yeah. I didn't want to cut off the point, but I was pretty sure, yeah.
It pretty much encompasses everything and kind of takes every factor into play as best they can. But there's definitely some flaws in it, I would say, especially we're looking at the season Bobby Witt Jr. is having. And this is not to take away from Bobby Witt Jr. in any way. He's having an incredible season. But from a WAR perspective, he's basically even with Aaron Judge. And a lot of that, and from the offensive perspective, that's really not viable. Judge is having a far better season offensively, you could objectively say, than Bobby Witt Jr. But, it brings the question of, how much does Witt Jr.'s defense, he's probably the best defensive shortstop in the league, but how much does that contribute to winning a baseball game? And I think maybe the WAR statistic itself might overemphasize defense in the calculation.
Maybe. We also just don't even know how to really value defense properly. So that's also something to take into account. I'm sure in the future when we actually value defense, I think someday we'll be able to value defense well. But right now we don't really know. We really can't quantify that well how good of a defender a baseball player is.
I feel like transitions well into sort of the football side of this, because it's you're the evaluating defensive ability in baseball, you're still working with only a couple elements. You're working with where they start with starting position. You're working with the speed with which they get off. Then you're working with how optimal their path was to the ball. These are and then you're working with how well they actually catch it when they get there. We're working with a limited number of features. While when we think about football, and how many features there are. It sort of emphasizes why it's been so much easier for baseball to adopt this analytics than football has in terms of the pace of that adoption. Because frankly, the lift to developing baseball analytics is comparatively a lot lower. Although I would say that's not entirely fair, because football has the benefit of baseball having gone first, so it gets to learn from not just baseball but all the other sports that have since developed their analytical tools and can adapt and innovate based on that instead of having to reinvent the wheel in the same ways. But just to get into football WAR a little bit, football WAR in its current form is not very accepted or commonly used in the football world. The goal of analytics at its base level is separating what is innately true and what is reflective of context, right? And this can be with respect to individual performance in terms of a play, what did the individual actually do on that play and how much credit do they deserve? Or it could be a team. It's who did they play? It's how did their how did certain luck factors relate to these their performance? So in comparison to baseball, like it's just so much more difficult because of like the complexity and the interdependence of all the elements going on in a football play and the 22 players in the field who are all contributing in many ways to like these like varying degrees. Like a passing play, you have the quarterback, but then he's impacted by the blocking and the play call and the ability of the receivers to get open on their routes and the ability of the defenders to fulfill their responsibilities on the play. And that chess match of all the play calls going on between the offensive and defensive play callers, it just creates so much going on that it's often just too difficult to disentangle exactly what happened and who was responsible for it, especially when you don't exactly know these responsibilities.
Yeah, and going back to that, I think one of the reasons that war is not as accepted in the football space as war is accepted in the baseball space is because war is the stat, the singular advanced stat that like everybody's kind of come around to circle around because it's it's such a good, well-encompassing stat. But football is kind of going in a different direction because it's a completely different game. Like you said, there's so many different factors that it's hard to bring everything into one play, like one singular stat. And I think in football we've got really well accepted stats, advanced analytics like EPA per play and success rate that are becoming their own war of football. And that's for good reason. It's because they're pretty good at evaluating plays in football, because these are two completely different sports. And I don't think it's a necessity to get the same stat from a completely different sport into football.
No, I think that's fair. I think the focus on catch-all metrics is their ease of use and the way you can compare across position in ways that's ordinarily difficult. So like when you look at like the different catch-all metrics in football, like as you mentioned, we have EPA per play, we have success rate, that's sort of an offshoot of EPA per play that sort of tries to filter out the less sticky elements. We also have like PFF grades, we have SIS, like Sports Info Solutions total points, DVOA from what was originally Football Outsiders, that's now FTN Fantasy. ESPN QBR, that's sort of an altered version of EPA. But we have a lot of these things that have been seeking to do this quantification of like this one catch-all stat. And like that's in PFF and Sports Info Solutions have even built war stats based off of their these catch-all metrics that they've built. I think the whole war movement started with a paper from Ron Yurko, and then Eric Eager from PFF and Alex Vigerman from Sports Info Solutions just sort of built on the systems that their sites already had, grades for PFF and the total point system for Sports Info Solutions, to just sort of say how good are these players actually doing, quantifying it not just from their grading perspective, but trying to attach a win value to that.
Catch-all stats, I think, are great for people that aren't as invested as we are into our sports. I mean, we're the nerds. We're the people that love to look at all of these 50 different advanced analytics, and that's for good reason. I think there's a stat for every level of commitment viewer. If you want to look at war because you're not as invested into the different individual stats, like maybe ERA or OPS plus, stuff like that for baseball, then yeah, war might be good for you. But who are we to, like, the thing that makes catch-all stats not great is that who are we to quantify how a batter is in relation to a pitcher, is in relation to a fielder?
Yeah, and I think that the flaw that kind of comes with war is how it's used, like generally used by people out there. It's the fact that war is really just a counting stat. It's just to say, hey, this is how good this guy is right here. I'm trying to compare him to everybody else. And that becomes incredibly difficult in football when you have so many different positions and so many different players that do so many different things. It's kind of hard to compare a center to a cornerback. Like, it's just not... It's a little difficult to make that comparison. I feel like having one individual stat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also like you get at the methodologies and it kind of gets at that concept where PFF uses like the subjective grades while Sports Info Solutions uses more rigid EPA-based method that sort of looks at the points added from the play and apportions it based on a bunch of conditions that it has for the play. For example, I think one off the top of my head is like if as the run gets longer, the running back gets more and more responsibility for the yardage gained and the offensive line players get less. And that's how they sort of apportion the value. If you think about it, a 15-yard run or 30-yard run reflects more and after certain yardage, it sort of cuts off like a tax bracket. They'll give more and more credit. Whereas before contact, they're rare to give the running back credit for the yardage because they assume it's in large part the responsibility of the offensive line. So like that's the Sports Info Solutions way, and like they both have like their benefits in terms of how they go about calculating WAR. I think I wouldn't quite analogize it to like the Baseball Reference WAR versus the Fangraphs WAR sort of conundrum, because I think it's a little bit different in that they actually have different methodologies. They're not just different formulas using the same sort of underlying data. But I also think like tracking data sort of emphasizes how you can improve on these things, because you can more accurately account for the disparate impacts with respect to points added on a play, or with respect to PFF subjective grades, you can, with tracking data, more accurately quantify these sorts of things that are happening on the field that go into the grades.
Sorry, I do have a question. I feel like offensive linemen have been completely underrated for the history of football.
In general discourse, I would say.
American football. Like I've been telling, I'm not, obviously I haven't actually been telling the Jets because I can't, but I've been telling the Jets as a New York Jets fan for years to get a good offensive line. And this is the first year that they finally put together a good offensive line. Their backup this year was their first round pick, Olu
Fashanu,
yeah. And he's great, and he's going to start for Morgan Moses this week. But in the news, when Morgan Moses went down, it wasn't that big, I thought. Like even now, like I feel like offensive linemen don't get enough attention. And I also just are there any, like, maybe it's because there aren't enough advanced statistics out there to quantify offensive lineman play? Is that?
Yeah, we have the PFF grades. I feel like that's like why they got so popular to begin with, because people struggle to quantify these plays, and like that's something certainly discussed in like in terms of offensive line play. It's grown in discussion, I think, as a result of the ability to quantify these things. But we also have some better metrics now that aren't just a grade. We have some more specific stuff that can tell you the pressure rate allowed by a specific offensive lineman in terms of his responsibilities on a play, or even more, just not just pressures allowed, but did he win the snaps, and that would be pass block or run block win rate. So these things can sort of tell you like the extent or how often, from a success rate basis, an offensive lineman will be accomplishing his responsibilities on a given play.
Yeah, and personally, myself, that's what I look to PFF for is the dirty work, the offensive linemen that aren't getting any credit unless they pancake someone flat on the ground, or the defensive backs that are only getting talked about if they let someone burn past them. So. And you look at how a game is displayed, an NFL game is displayed. When you're watching maybe your team's on offense, you're probably looking at the quarterback. If your team's on defense, you're probably still looking at the quarterback, or maybe you're looking at a defensive lineman. Nobody, and the camera doesn't even show anything further than 15 yards down the field. So how are you going to judge a corner other than looking at an all-22 film? So for me, yes, it's the guys in the trenches, it's the guys playing corner. That's what I look to PFF for. For wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, stuff like that. The fun stuff, the fun players that we were all introduced to when we first got into the game. That's what I look to for the eye test, and maybe some of the more advanced analytics like EPA, success rate, rush yards over expected, stuff like that.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think that you rely more on your eye test for those positions because you feel like you have a greater ability to judge, or is it more a product of just we watch this game for fun, and that's like one of the fun parts of the game is how good is this player that I'm watching and comparing and stacking him up against everyone else? Like honestly, like I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just it's a universal thing that people can watch quarterbacks play, and maybe not everybody's the best at judging them, but like, how am I going to go up to my friend on the street and talk to him about how Taylor Decker had a great game last week? Like, unless Taylor Decker got blown past or injured, like, we're not really going to be talking about him unless he made a pancake block. So, I just think that everybody thinks that they are a genius when it comes to quarterback eye tests, wide receiver eye tests, and running back eye tests. So, that's what I think. That's why I think people love the skill position so much, is that you can see them, unless they're going on a go route 20 yards down the field, you're going to be watching them on TV. You don't have to dig into the all-22 film. You don't have to go out of your way to view them. Whereas an offensive lineman, unless I'm a former retired offensive lineman, which I definitely am not, I'm probably not going to be looking at the offensive line unless I am scouting a player.
You should see this guy in front of us. He is definitely not a former offensive lineman.
Appreciate that.
I will say, I think I feel like the sacks allowed or sacks a taken stat, it more falls on the quarterback, I feel like, or the media puts it more on the quarterback, that sacks taken stat. I don't know. It's never the offensive lineman. It's like, I don't know. Is that like something that's like going to end up? You're pointing the finger. You
Yeah.
start talking.
No, yeah. I mean, it's been a very popular thing to talk about. As we've gotten further into the years of advanced analytics of who the blame falls on for any given mishap. What got me Twitter famous one time for the first time ever was when I posted a really cool data visualization where I was just kind of poking around, and I found that QB EPA per non-sack dropback was negatively correlated with sack rate of quarterbacks. So, the guys that were getting sacked more were less efficient than, guys that were getting sacked less, and it, wasn't including, obviously, those plays where they were getting sacked. And that just kind of revealed to us that, sacks are a QB stat. And obviously you can't just say that definitively, but definitely more than, the average couch ball watcher that hates, when an offensive lineman gets beat or whatever. But like if a quarterback's back there taking, 8 seconds in the pocket, then, that's definitely on them. And it's not just that. It's more so in the current football world, it's about being able to evade pressures and get out of sacks. Guys like Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert and Josh Allen have made their careers off of that, is being able to buy themselves extra time, being able to roll out, and sometimes turning plays where a guy that is immobile, like a Jared Goff or a Tom Brady, they could turn that into a rolling out touchdown pass.
I think this kind of returns to the point of we kind of need player tracking to be better. And the reason I say that is because, you can kind of make these assumptions, but at the end of the day, if you don't have a true, like, quantifiable reason for, like, why this occurred, like, why did this sack happen, it's kind of hard to say, whether it was on a quarterback, whether it was on an offensive lineman definitively. And so from that perspective, I think the WAR statistic itself, getting back to the stat, is that we need some sort of quantifiable way to say, like, this player was where he was supposed to be, or like this player performed his assignment correctly, from a tracking perspective. And I think that returns to the point of kind of WAR in general, and to the defensive point, like that's what it is. It's what's needed at this point.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the one thing that I think that makes it so, like, we're aiming for the best solution, not the perfect solution. And one thing I think that's, like, interesting about football is, like, when we talk about responsibilities, those are knowable to an extent, I think is the way I'd put it, because you really can't know what's being coached in practice. And that's why I think, like, when a lot of these analytics first started coming out in terms of, like, WAR and success rate, coaches would prefer their internal metrics for how they would grade players in every play in a similar sort of manner as PFF did, or calculate a success rate based on their own internal metrics of what was a success. And I don't think that was something that's necessarily worse, but it's interesting because they have a different knowledge, an asymmetric knowledge that we can't have, which is what was actually being asked of this player on each play, and what was being practiced and what was being coached.
No, I think the future might be, I've been thinking of putting wristbands on every player's wrist to see, like, if they're feeling happy or sad, or like seriously, because it might affect their play. It probably does affect their play, right? If they're, like, how good they're feeling, how confident they're feeling that day.
Yeah, and something that's been really interesting to me is in the golf space, they've started putting these Whoop wristbands on players, and that's been able to track their heartbeats. So, everybody likes to look at Tiger Woods making a putt back in the day, saying, "Oh, this guy's got balls of steel." But was it really his physical, body that was perfect, or was he actually, just mentally there? And like, obviously there might be a future in analytics for stuff like that, but I just think that's so cool to show to the fans of, this guy is physically and mentally locked in.
Yeah.
And man, that's a whole nother conversation right there, talking about the mental aspect of the game. Because quantifying the mental takes us into a different discussion for sure.
I was gonna say, speaking of physically and mentally locked in, I feel like we have someone we need to talk about.
So another segment that we're going to do here on every podcast is our recent news. And we just want to dig real quick into some of the things that have been happening lately, especially, and dig deeper into the numbers that are surrounding those occurrences. And yeah, who Jake is referring to is the legend himself, who we hit on earlier a little bit. But it's Shohei Ohtani, this guy right now for the Dodgers. The Angels really messed up by not well, at least not winning a championship or not even going to the playoffs with Trout and Ohtani together, which is absurd. But
just shows that baseball's a team sport.
That is true. You need more than two players, right? And you need pitching.
Even if one of those two players is like 5 players morphed into one player.
Exactly, and that kind of digs into our conversation of WAR a little bit and just how much value Ohtani offers as both a pitcher and a hitter. There was a game last year, I believe, where he had 0.8 WAR in a game, 0.4 from the pitching side and 0.4 from the hitting side, which I know John doesn't enjoy me hearing, just Francisco Lindor and the MVP race and whatnot. But Ohtani had a performance last week in Miami that was we could make the argument it's the greatest individual single game performance of all time.
I think it is.
100%.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because let's just frame it here. So he was 6 for 6, 3 home runs, 10 RBIs, 2 doubles, 2 steals. He had 0.7 WAR in the game. now to frame this a little bit more,
As a DH.
the 0.8 that he had last year, it was 0.4 from both sides of the playing field.
Yeah.
This was all offensively. He doesn't even play defense either. It's not like he had a diving play that supplemented 0.1 WAR to the game total. It was 0.7 WAR, all offense. And what he did in the game was also reach 50-50, 50 home runs, 50 stolen bases, the first to ever do it in MLB history.
Well, not to rain on the parade here, but
if you say something about Lindor right
I was
now.
gonna
No,
say,
no, no,
you're
I'm
gonna
not-
hear a Lindor MVP
I'm not
thing.
going to talk about, well, now that you mentioned Lindor is the name coming out of my mouth. But I will say, people have been saying that it is easier to steal bases this year than ever before.
That's
I bet
true.
Ricky Henderson, he could steal 200 bases this year, and that's, to be honest, not even an exaggeration. I mean, Ricky was like, he stole like, what was his season high? Like
130 or
No, you know better than me. I'm sure.
it was 130.
I can look it up here.
Two or
I thought it
somewhere
was
in
like
there.
121 or something.
Yeah, it might have been. It was up there. It was a lot.
It was a lot. It was
No,
definitely.
I trust your baseball judgment on this.
Let's
one.
see. 130, yeah.
Okay,
130
yeah,
in
yeah.
1982. 130 steals, 42 caught stealings. 42 caught stealings, also the most in the league that year. But
Yeah, I was gonna
still.
say they would never let someone have that success rate right now. Like I feel like that 75% success rate. Like usually I think they optimized like when they were increasing the backs. When I remember they were trying to optimize for like a success rate of like 85% because that's what will like,
80-ish.
Yeah, it's like somewhere like that, and then they'll actually make them like let them run. So like it is also like as I was gonna just say before, like it's a lot easier to steal bases for a very clear reason. It's literally less distance.
Yeah, literally. Yeah. And it's like it's a pizza box over there now. Pizza box is huge.
So Ohtani had 2 steals in that game, kind of supplementing to the WAR. And to frame this a little bit more, I just want to note something about Babe Ruth's 1923 season, which was the highest individual WAR season in MLB history. He averaged 0.09 WAR per game that full season. Now, this is talking about the best individual season in MLB history. He averaged 0.09 WAR per game. Put that next to Ohtani's single game performance. That's nearly 8 times more in a single game. I don't know what else to say about this. We were talking about WAR and maybe it has some flaws and whatnot, but we were talking about defense too as pointing towards some of the flaws. He doesn't play defense. He's a designated hitter who had 0.7 WAR in a single game. So it's pretty impressive. And
Very impressive.
yeah. And when you dig in a little deeper on Ohtani, like it's hard to pinpoint anything that he doesn't do well at the plate, just looking at him as a hitter. But if I had to, left-handed pitchers can kind of get to him a little bit. He has a high whiff rate. He's 22nd percentile whiff rate in the league, and that's not great. That's also on this podcast we're going to be referencing Baseball Savant all the time. I should note. So, thank you, Baseball Savant, for the work that you
Thank
do.
you, Baseball Savant.
Thank you, baseball savant.
But yeah, so he's he whiffs a fair amount. When he gets into a 2-strike count, that whiff rate completely drops, and he begins a completely better hitter. Lefties can kind of work low and in on him and throw some breaking balls away, but that's like the only way you're getting this dude out. If you're a right-handed pitcher, have fun.
Has anyone looked at like the swing path data based on like Ohtani and the different like sort of like versus 2-strike situations versus just sort of like how he's approaching a 0-0 count and how that changes?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that a little bit more. But what I will say is that he has one of the longer swings in baseball, which isn't generally the best. It's good to get extended for power numbers. It really increases your power numbers big time. And Savant did all this great stuff this year, adding bat tracking, for those of you who don't know. But Ohtani has a generally long swing, and yeah, it allows him to trade extension, but I think it creates that one hole low and in, and that's where he strikes out a lot. You'll see a lot of changeups, fastballs, changeups, low and in against him, especially against lefties. He'll tend to struggle more on those pitches, and I think the long swing path kind of plays into that. But I mean, we're just nitpicking at this point. I mean, he's way too good.
There's no hitter that's perfect.
Yeah.
You can't.
I mean, I feel like the main sort of story in football right now is offense sort of falling or being less enthusiastic, like being less strong than it has been in past years. That's certainly a point that's been contended. I won't say that I won't share the blame for that being part of the narrative, considering some data I put out there after week 1. But I will say that like the data certainly leveled out a little bit now. It seems a little bit more like the passing game isn't just completely dying. But there are some crazy stats. Week 1 was the first in the 32-team era since 2002 where there were more rushing touchdowns than passing. And I think it's just like one of those things where we're not really sure whether this is really a spike, whether this is rather a drop in passing, or whether it's just a product of sort of a spike that happened in the last couple of years. Like I know, Jack, this is a point you feel strongly about.
No, I mean, for sure. I mean, some of the graphs that you've put out, some of the graphs that many great people in the community have put out, I mean, it's kind of crazy to look at that spike that we see in around the 2019, 2020, 2021 years, because and the idea behind, and it's a spike in passing efficiency, passing volume, passing touchdowns, any passing stat that you can think of, and the idea behind it is that these defenses were less prepared. Defenses against the pass is a lot harder to prepare for and play for when you're not able to meet up as much due to COVID restrictions and cautions. And I thought that was so interesting, and now it's kind of just it's been going into this nosedive, to where it's regressing to the mean, and the run game is definitely having a lot more of an impact than it did in previous years. And I know the football media space has kind of gotten into this a little bit recently about cover 2 shells being the only thing to counter these high-powered passing offenses like the Kansas City Chiefs. And Mel Kiper personally made me pretty mad when he said that the NFL should consider banning cover 2 shells, which I just think is ridiculous. I mean, what did you think about that, Jake?
I thought it was a wild oversimplification of the problem. And like I think I said this on Twitter, but I'll repeat it here. It's like if you think that there's like one clean, simple answer for how to like sort of swing the pendulum back and have offensive efficiency start increasing again, I think you're just oversimplifying what's a really complex problem. As we sort of hit on the war conversation, football is a really complex sport. Like it's not just cover 2 shells, but how they rotate these shells post snap into different coverages, and how they disguise their pressures in terms of simulating the pressure with guys along the line, and then how they marry these two things in terms of how they disguising what they're doing both with respect to blitzing and pass rushing, and with respect to their coverage, and how they're combining these things, and how they have new motion rules to sort of handle the different things that offenses are throwing at them to sort of actually build much, frankly, stronger and smarter defenses. And there are some answers out there. Like I think you've seen teams sort of spam play action, to use like, a video game term. They spam motion and motion at the snap because these are things that can sort of give you an edge over a defense. And they sort of like alleviate some of the problems. Like motion certainly is like, sort of taken over the sport, and motion can, help you define whether a defense in a certain coverage. It can force a defense to adjust their coverage based on how you want them to, based on your alignment. Or it can even, if you're doing motion at the snap especially, really just impact how a defense is even able to play you because they don't have time to adjust, and therefore you can sort of create leverage points with your wide receiver alignments that the defense wasn't prepared for. So this sort of chess match is definitely hitting a really interesting point where it's sort of I think equilibrating in a way that offenses had the advantage for years, but that's less true. Like Steve Palazzolo, I think the PFF analyst, had like a great point about this in the PFF book, Football's a Numbers Game by Matthew Collar. Would recommend it to anyone listening to this. If you're interested in analytics, you will really love this book, especially football analytics. But I remember the point that Steve hit on was how defensive coaches have kind of always been looking for this edge in the modern game. They're always playing they're always playing response. They're not necessarily able to dictate as much. And this idea of what information can we have, both from just a personnel play identification perspective, which I think seems the most simplistic version of it, to how they could sort of leverage other edges, is sort of seemed to take off, and from his opinion sort of made more sense because of this role that they sort of play in the sort of balance between offense and defense. And it also sort of kind of aligns with kind of the way they're all sort of using nickel as a base. But I feel like the point to emphasize, the design run efficiency isn't particularly up from years past. Most of the increase in rushing efficiency is coming from QB scrambling, which is happening at higher rates for a multitude of reasons. Meaning who's coming to the league, what these guys are, what the offenses are being built to do. You see sort of the scramble rates increase alongside the sack rates, and the sort of net efficiency is still a little bit up. But I think it's still pretty clearly more efficient to pass than run. And I feel like that's getting a little bit lost in the weeds here because there's a trend. People are missing what's still true in the sport right now.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, everybody loves to talk about how, passing is more efficient than running, but as you said earlier, Jake, it is a perfect marriage between these two things. One can't be efficient without the other. And I think, a lot of teams in the modern era have gotten so swept up about, let's get this perfect Kansas City Chiefs dynasty quarterback set up where we've got Patrick Mahomes who can scramble out of everything. It doesn't matter who we put on the offensive line, and, get some good play design, get some motion, and get some guys that can, work down the field and open up spots in the middle, and everything's going to be perfect. But you lose the context that it is the running game that still sets these things up. It sets up the play action. Nobody's going to bite on a play action run if you guys have passed the ball for 80% of the plays to get downfield. You can have an average quarterback with Jared Goff.
Hey, whoa.
But you can still have a high-powered offense built on the run game. I mean, Jamison Williams is a guy that, I love to break out this year. And, he, I don't think is anywhere near as good of a receiver going downfield without the run game, setting up, play action passes and stuff. And, the Lions are a team that's heavily invested in the run game. They drafted Penei Sewell, Frank Ragnow, and Taylor Decker, all with first-round picks.
The best offensive line in the league.
Of course. Now that Jason Kelsey's gone out of the Eagles, I think it's pretty clear. But they spent
a debate for another time.
They spent 3 first-round picks on those guys, and they spent up to bring back Graham Glasgow, and they also spent up big time in free agency to get Kevin Zeitler. They brought in David Montgomery and spent a very high draft pick on Jahmyr Gibbs. And, this is an offense that's showing, we might be in the world of passing, dominating football, but our passing offense, we might not have a great quarterback. We might not have wide receiver depth, but it's built on the run game. And we can still have successful passing with that.
I mean, I just feel like that's part of the thing that I think is getting misframed with this debate is that it is about run pass, but it's also really way more about offense versus defense. Like, you look at the run and pass efficiency, and they're relatively correlated in how they move year to year. Whereas, the offense, with the underlying efficiency, which makes sense on some level, right? Like, offenses either have the edge over the defenses, and they're dictating, or at other times the defense is dictating. This intention of avoiding explosive plays with too high coverage, it applies to the run and pass game the same. It's sort of that same idea from baseball when they started playing their defensive outfielders really far back to avoid these extra base hits. I think that's from a Russell Carlton baseball perspective piece from a couple of years ago. But I think it's just this idea of if you stand the guys farther back, inherently they're going to be in front of you. You're going to be able to keep more things in front of you, and that applies to explosive runs as well. But I think teams are just generally sort of shying away from things that can put them in greater risk. That's why they're doing zone coverage versus man coverage to begin with, right? Because it doesn't leave you with this weak link system of one guy making a failure and it's a blown coverage, but these sort of much broader things.
Yeah, and even at a much lower level of football with our flag football leagues on Fridays, it's not even a question when we're playing defense of what we're playing. We're playing zone coverage because, no matter who's in front of you, nobody wants to be left on an island. And I don't know if that's as much built on, everything that we've been talking in the grand scheme, or maybe the higher powered wide receivers are just that good, or maybe the corner selection is just not that good nowadays. But
I don't know. They call me Ilievsky Island back in the day. I was the best corner in my flag football league in 5th grade.
But you see these top guys even sometimes, though. Maybe not the top, but a lot of these high up guys, they can get burned sometimes. Even the best in their craft can give up a home run ball. And, it's it's zone coverage that allows these guys to put less pressure on themselves, and it's I think it's definitely the way of the future, whether the old heads like it or not.
Well, I think it's the trade-offs for the offense, because the defense wants you to say, oh, we're going to run the ball, which is less efficient than passing, right? Or they want you to say, we're just going to throw underneath and let our yak guys take care of it, which has kind of been the meta to sort of respond to these things. And I don't think either of those are necessarily the right answer, because they play into the defense's hand. Now, if I had the right answer, I'd be working for an NFL team as an offensive coordinator, because none of these guys seem to have it necessarily outside Kevin O'Connell. But that all being said, that's more of a joke. I do think these guys have it's been a strong sort of counterpunch from the defense right now in this tug of war between offense and defense that's always going on. And frankly, I wouldn't really venture to guess where exactly it's going from here. Like when teams first started deploying this too high coverage in what I think was like 2022, I wasn't, it certainly didn't occur to me, and I don't think it was immediately obvious that this spelled the sort of, like one piece that was going to cause, efficiency as a whole and passing efficiency to start dropping. I don't think that was immediately obvious then, and I think that the hindsight bias goes, oh, of course. But frankly, I don't think I can confidently predict the direction of this in the NFL going forward, because there's always a new wrinkle. There's always going to be another development that I couldn't foresee with schematically, that in terms of how teams are playing this sort of chess match.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here. Just a quick deviation. For baseball, according to I guess comparing the pass run from football to baseball, it's almost like home runs and small ball, right? I guess I feel like at some point a team is going to say, you know what, we're not going to go for guys who hit home runs. We're going to go for guys who just steal bases. And this team is going to steal 500 bases, and they're going to do it at a great percentage, and they're going to have a good offense with a low OPS. I think that I don't know. I kind of want to know what you think about that, Devin.
Yeah, I think to your point, John, what kind of occurs is baseball and football and analytics in general kind of flow with the trends of what's kind of happening. Yeah. And I think
then they go against them a little. Once you start going towards a trend so much, when all the teams start going there, there's that one team that pulls back. Like the Nationals, for example, they have over 200 steals as a team this year. I think there's going to be a team that just completely flies by that.
Well, they're super young too, right? That's I feel like that's just a product of where the Nationals are in their rebuilding
That's
cycle.
True.
Partly,
yeah.
But I think a lot of the rise in power becoming such a big thing came from the steroid era, and guys are hitting so many home runs, and you kind of saw that roll over into the modern game. And I think the rule changes, the bigger bases, the pickoff limit, pitch clock, those all kind of play into the steals increasing, but I just don't know if it will be a long-term trend, because there's only so much you can do with a steal, and there's only such a high percentage that you can steal bases. So the more you steal, the more likely the catcher is to know that you're stealing. Teams can kind of game plan for that a little bit better. And, I just don't see teams stealing an excessive amount as part of that integral game plan.
That's true, but theoretically, if you get really if you get 9 fast guys in your lineup and they get on base just enough, I feel like with the bigger bases, with the pitch clock, with the only 2 pickoffs allowed, I think it's possible to steal. I did this in the Out of the Park baseball simulation.
Yeah, I love that game.
Yeah, I've gotten over 500 steals. Now I don't know, obviously, but it is the most realistic GM baseball game out there.
That's true.
And I did and I wasn't managing these games either. I simulated these games. I wasn't playing all 162 games myself.
Your
and
tendencies
dictated.
were probably max steal.
Yeah. But Mark Kotze, who's the manager of the A's, which I guess I was controlling the Athletics in this simulation, he does have a high steal kind of rate as himself as the manager.
I think this discussion of how rule changes have kind of impacted, you kind of brought that idea up. Yeah. It's become a huge thing, especially in baseball, but I'd say in football too. There's been a few things, but
I mean, yeah, in terms of rule changes, I feel like that's one of those things that's definitely motivated sometimes by analytics and certainly directed. I feel like baseball, but that's been really true in terms of how you've been sort of, baseball, the rule change has been very directed at reorienting the game around some past version of it that we're striving for. I will try to say that in a way that isn't derisive, because whatever, it's fine. Games evolve, is my opinion. But anyway, a lot of these points, they've been sort of incentivizing this behavior that they want, right? You make the bases bigger so that you get more steals. You have a pitch clock that's effectively stopping how long the pitcher's taken. Hopefully, actually, causing teams to maybe either let starting pitchers stay later in the game or to use less relievers. They certainly have these rules around how many relievers you can roster now that weren't there before. That and pitchers in general that are getting at this idea of we have a version of the game that we want to see and we're going to incentivize. And it's very reminiscent, I think, of law and economics sort of thinking of, we're just going to create the behavior through the rule structures that we have. And football does a lot of that too, but I think in a less sort of obvious way. I think it's more we're going to address the rate at which we call this penalty. I think one of the more obvious recent versions of it was the dynamic kickoff, right? It's we don't like how many injuries are on this kickoff. We don't like the fact that there's no returns. We're going to try to change it, and we're going to try to get more returns. And they're honestly, I don't think, probably satisfied with the return rate they're seeing this year, which is honestly a very minor increase because they didn't, I think, go as far enough as they should have in terms of incentivizing teams to return. So I think, as you'll see, they'll probably just move the touch back to the 35 instead of the 30, maybe move where they kick off from 5 yards back. I think there's this idea that football is much more willing, even in the middle of the season, to sort of start emphasizing and de-emphasizing certain things to sort of create the league they want to see.
And I certainly don't think that it's derisive to say that baseball is kind of catering to an older audience in a way, especially with those changes that it's making. Yeah, it's in a way reverting back to older things, whereas football, like you noted, is kind of moving forward a little bit more, I would say. And I think that definitely comes with, like I said, the audience. Baseball is trying to cater to an audience which is a little bit older, and I don't think anybody's really denying that. But at the same time, there's ways to grow the game and make it more exciting and keep it fresh, like the pitch clock. We're keeping things moving. So it's baseball is trying to cater to both types of people at the same time, and I feel like there should be some conflict in that. But at the same time, I personally think the rule changes did wonders. In my opinion,
I agree.
I mean, games are so much quicker. There's so much, for the average fan, so much more manageable to get through, and the game happens at a faster rate. But
it was meant to be these time things. They're supposed to be a 15-second. All this time, it just wasn't followed.
Yeah, exactly. Throughout the history of baseball, we've seen pitchers work very quickly. You watch old video, and it doesn't even have to be that old. We could go back to even the 80s, 90s, and we're watching guys grab the ball, get back on the mound, throw another pitch. There's none of this other, let me wipe my brow and, do whatever between every pitch.
But they weren't throwing 100 every time. We are stressing arms in a way that wasn't true before. That I don't know enough of the the bio stats here in terms of how time off in between pitches impacts elbow injuries, but I feel like there's got to be some sort of relationship there, and that's also, I feel like, one of the burgeoning, if not known and problems in baseball is elbow injuries for pitchers because of how hard they're being pushed.
Yeah, certainly. And what's generally accepted in the biomechanics community, from what I've understood, is that what we're seeing now is guys throwing at match effort every single pitch, for the most part. Starters might tone it down a little bit, but, back in the day, even if you look at back in the 80s, for example, we have Jack Morris coming out on 3 days rest instead of 4 or 5, and he's coming out and he knows that he's going out to throw 120 pitches. With that mindset, you're going to go out and you're not giving nearly max effort on every single pitch. Whereas now we see pitchers going out and the goal is to maximize the value of every single pitch that's thrown. And so in order to do that, you're going to want to have the best possible pitch you can throw come out of your hand and cross the plate. And with that comes faster fatigue, and the pitch clock doesn't necessarily help that. I think it's still to be seen what the impacts of that are on injuries. And so when we're discussing that younger perspective that's starting to come out in the game, some of these new age rule changes, or whether it's the biomechanics stuff, which is really up and coming and something that's really going to start taking over in coming years. And that's not just the case for pitchers. We can talk about football. We're going to start looking at football biomechanics. It's going to have to start happening if it's not already, just general movement of how players work on the field. But that kind of brings us into our perspective that we offer as college students, as young people who have been around the game and have been around statistics since we got into sports. And so I kind of pose the question to everybody here, what kind of perspective do we offer as clubs, as individuals, on just stats and analytics in sports as a whole?
So yeah, I feel like the thing that we sort of feel like when we started talking about doing this was we have this younger mindset. We were sort of born and raised in this analytics world, and I think that sort of leaves us open-minded to certain things, where we're not closed off to certain ideas. The sort of entrenched dogmas of the sport aren't locked within us. But I think it's also not getting caught up in the dogma of analytics either. It's sort of like, we haven't been part of, the fight to sort of get analytics respected in a lot of ways. So we're not locked into some of the takes. We're just, I think, trying to come at it with open mind, open arms, and hey, what's really going on here with like sort of a research oriented perspective. Like with football, the fact that it's growing so much and there's still so much to learn has really made the field like a meritocracy, and that you can contribute to football analytics by just kind of thinking about problems and that aren't yet answered in the space, and researching the question until you find a satisfying answer. And I think we'd hope to discuss this like sort of new research that's continually coming out in football, that has recently come out, and really focus on this idea of like where football is going and where analytics is going, as you sort of mentioned with biomechanics. Like I think that's a great example of something that we'd want to explore and sort of say, where is this now? How could it grow? And what are we looking at in 10 years?
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, the answer to this question is just that we can get so much more out of this sport. I mean, my parents, people that were born into this sport a lot older than us, they're, at the end of the day, they're probably looking at box scores for the most part, and they're probably looking at, oh, this guy got more passing yards than this guy. This guy turned the ball over less than this guy. And I think we've created this world of, I've been a part of this world of analytics where, there's just so much more that you can dive into. There's so many different stats. Like, I don't have enough time in the day to analyze every single thing, but I'd love to. And, like when you look at the different, when I go into a club meeting for our football analytics club, when I walk in, we're not talking about who has more passing yards. We're not talking about who has more passing touchdowns. If you do, you're probably in the wrong room, because the first thing that we'll talk about when we're looking at a quarterback is what was their EPA per play, what was their pressure to sack ratio, like things like that. And I can, if I had enough hours in the day, I could literally dive into all of these things for as long as I really wanted, like over 100 hours if I wanted to, and I wasn't getting tired. Looking at film, looking at like the resources that we have available to us is completely different, and we have a different perspective on things because that's what we were born into.
Right. I mean, we didn't just fall out of a coconut tree, right, guys? Like, we exist. Like, no, I'm not going to do the whole quote, but like, yeah, I think that's the idea of here of like, we exist in the context of all which came before us. Like, right. Like, we do know, you don't reinvent the wheel when you're getting to these things. And it's like having respect for all that came before you while trying to innovate and trying to learn as you sort of learn how to innovate. And I think that's the idea, because as Jack said, I think there's like an almost not infinite, I think that's the wrong word, but there's not enough time in the day if you spend all your time working on these problems to really even solve half of them. So it's just fun to sort of dig in to the extent you can.
Yeah, I think it's not even just like the NFL and the MLB, like all these big professional sports leagues. Like obviously they're using analytics, and obviously they need to improve, and they will improve on analytics. But it's also these small leagues. Like I worked for I guess a collegiate summer professional baseball league 2 summers ago. I'm not going to mention them on air, but basically I worked for one of the teams there, and they don't really use analytics that much. So it's not like every sports team is using analytics. I think what you guys, I'm a guest on this podcast. I don't know if I'm going to be here every week. I want to thank you guys for having me. But
you'll be here again.
Oh yes, let's go. But yeah, it's not everyone is using analytics, and I think it's important for the word to be put out there more, and I think that's why you guys are doing this.
Well, I appreciate all the perspectives that each of you have brought to this very first episode of the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast. It's been super fun, super insightful, and we're definitely going to have a lot more fun conversations and kind of dig in a little deeper, as if we didn't dig in deep enough today. But we will. We'll dig in deeper. We definitely will. And a few topics that we might be looking into here in the future. We talked about it today. We talked about rule changes. I'd love to have another discussion of that moving forward. So you might hear some of that from us.
Some debates.
Yeah. I know you like the debate. We can do a little back and forth. But
you should really be the lawyer in this room, man. Yeah, you love this argumentation.
No, I can't. Yeah. I would never be able to. It's too much work.
Yeah, Jake's the law student, John.
I know. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of work, right?
I don't know. I say that as though I didn't just record an hour-long football podcast, but yeah, it's a lot of work.
But yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of topics that we'd love to cover in this podcast, and we hope that you will all join us. So what we're going to be having is some football dedicated podcast episodes. We're going to have some baseball dedicated ones. We'll probably do a few where we kind of encompass everything together. And these guys are mocking me right now because I use my hands when I talk. Listen, I'm Italian. That's what we do. We use our hands when we talk.
A millionaire.
And
Don't include that. I'm not. I don't want any trouble.
Yeah, we're going to cover some really cool stuff with respect to football and maybe do some real interesting research to try to look at some of these issues we've been talking about today.
Yeah, and it's going to be, definitely super interesting to take some dives into some of these topics that, maybe you don't see out there a ton too. Maybe we'll get really deep. We're going to get really deep here into the numbers. Let's do it.
It's what the people want. Right?
That is true. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you join us again next time. And from here at the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast, we will see you later.